Um, Imagine for just a second that you are standing on the highest balcony of an imperial palace in the late 6th century.
Oh, wow, okay. Setting the scene early.
Yeah. I mean, you could be looking out from the opulent courts of Constantinople, right? The beating heart of the Byzantine Empire. Or maybe you're in Ctesiphon, the grand capital of the Sassanid Persians.
Right, the two massive superpowers of the ancient world.
Exactly. So you're up there on this balcony, cast your eyes southward toward the Arabian Peninsula. From those elevated imperial vantage points, looking through the eyes of those ancient emperors, what do you actually see?
To them, a whole lot of nothing.
Literally nothing. It was a geographical void to them,
Mhm.
a scorched expanse of jagged basalt and just endless sand, an immense, terrifying silence devoid of any civilization worth noting.
Yeah, a wasteland they felt they could comfortably just ignore.
Right. But today, in this deep dive, we're taking the excerpt from the Jahiliyyah, a civilization waiting to ignite. And our mission is to bust that myth of the empty desert wide open. We are looking at a civilization vibrating with complex energy, driven by high-stakes global commerce, and fueled by this intense spiritual hunger that was, frankly, about to alter human history.
It really requires a fundamental shift in perspective. I mean, those emperors were looking at a blank space on their maps, largely because they were conditioned to only recognize civilization if it looked like their own.
Right, if it didn't have marble.
Exactly. Cities of marble, centralized bureaucracies, standing armies. If it didn't have those, it wasn't civilized. They completely missed the pressure cooker building right under their noses.
A pressure cooker is a great way to put it.
Yeah, and as the source material puts it, this was a civilization waiting to ignite. To grasp the monumental historical shifts about to happen, specifically the emergence of the prophet from the Valley of Mecca, you really have to understand the intricate, highly contradictory world that made his arrival necessary.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the global geopolitical context here, it sets the entire stage. The text shows us that by the late 6th century, those two titan empires, the Byzantines and the Sassanids, were essentially punching themselves into total exhaustion.
Oh, absolutely. Decades of relentless proxy wars had drained everything, their treasuries, their manpower.
And then we see this crucial pivot, right? The Treaty of 561 CE.
Yes, a massive turning point.
It isn't just a piece of paper. It physically redirects the entire global trade network. It pulls the lucrative trade routes away from the war-torn, destabilized Persian Gulf and funnels them straight down toward the relatively modest sanctuary city of Mecca. The world's wealth bypasses the emperors and flows directly into a geographical power vacuum.
The exhaustion of those empires really cannot be overstated. When you fight a decades-long war, the traditional arteries of commerce, like the Silk Road routes passing through Persia or the maritime routes of the Red Sea, they become too dangerous.
Or just too heavily taxed for merchants to use profitably.
Right. So the global economy desperately needed a new lifeline, and the Arabian Peninsula provided it through the legendary incense route. But to understand how trade functioned there, we first have to grapple with the landscape itself.
Because the geography was doing double duty.
Exactly. The geography of Arabia functions simultaneously as a prison and an impenetrable fortress.
Nature built some serious defenses. The geography dictates the entire political reality of the era. Up on the northern borders, you had Arab kingdoms like the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids.
And because they lived on accessible terrain near the Fertile Crescent, they were vulnerable.
Right, they eventually had to bow down and become vassal states, essentially proxy armies for the Byzantine and Persian emperors.
But the interior is a completely different story.
A totally different world. We are talking about regions like the Hijaz and the Nejd, protected by the Herat.
Ah, the Herat. These are impassable fields of sharp, black, volcanic basalt rock.
You couldn't march an imperial phalanx across them if you tried.
Not a chance. The terrain would literally shred their boots and the hooves of their horses.
And beyond the volcanic fields, you have the oceans of sand acting as literal moats. The Great Nafud in the north, and the legendary Rub al-Khali, or Empty Quarter, in the south.
To give you a sense of scale, the Empty Quarter alone is roughly the size of France.
Wow.
It is an ocean of dunes where temperatures soar and water is virtually non-existent. The interior tribes used this incredibly harsh nature to remain unconquered. They preserved a culture that valued their autonomy above life itself.
No imperial tax collector or Roman legion could ever reach them.
Never.
Which makes their sudden leap to the center of global commerce so fascinating. Because of those northern imperial wars paralyzing the traditional routes, the interior wasn't just isolated anymore. It became the only viable path for wealth.
Yeah, you have these sprawling caravans starting all the way down in the verdant valleys of Yemen.
The Romans called it Arabia Felix, right?
Yes, happy Arabia,
Yeah.
because it was lush enough to support the agriculture of tree resins, specifically frankincense and myrrh.
And whoever controlled that frankincense essentially held the keys to the religious legitimacy of both Rome and Persia.
Without it, the emperors couldn't consecrate their cathedrals or their Zoroastrian fire temples.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, and I think the source makes this point beautifully, you realize this wasn't just a luxury good, it was the geopolitical oil of the ancient world.
That's a perfect modern analogy. The demand was entirely inelastic. And by the late 6th century, one specific group had brilliantly positioned themselves right at the heart of this river of wealth.
The tribe of Quraysh.
Yes, located in Mecca. They recognized that the world needed their territory, and they capitalized on it with remarkable sophistication.
Especially under the leadership of Hashim ibn Abd Manaf, the great-grandfather of the Prophet. He orchestrated something called the Ilaf.
The Elaf were incredibly sophisticated institutions of pacts and tribal diplomacy.
He's out there negotiating safe passage for these wealthy caravans during specific sacred months. Because Mecca is an anomaly. It's not a lush agricultural oasis like Yathrib to the north where you can grow date palms and actually sustain a population. Mecca is a barren valley,
Its entire survival depended on positioning itself as a haram.
a demilitarized sanctuary zone. In a landscape defined by the Ghazwa, the constant threat of the tribal raid, Mecca was the one place where you had to check your weapons at the door.
The concept of the haram was an absolute necessity for survival. I mean, think about the logistics of moving thousands of camels laden with fortunes in frankincense across a landscape populated by nomadic tribes whose primary economy was raiding.
Right, how do you stop them?
You can't use a standing army. No one tribe has that kind of power. So you use divine threat. You establish a sanctuary backed by the gods.
The Quraysh basically turned Mecca into a financial hub akin to a modern neutral banking state, like an ancient Switzerland.
Exactly. You could trade safely under the protection of the divine, and as a result, commerce simply exploded.
But securing international trade pacts is one thing. The day-to-day psychological reality of living in this environment is another entirely. The margins for error in the 6th century Arabian desert were zero.
Absolutely zero. A dried-up well or a single stolen flock of sheep meant starvation for your family.
To manage that razor-thin line between survival and death, the Arabs adhered to an unwritten, fiercely rigid moral code known as Miruwa.
Muruwa is the glue holding this decentralized society together. It translates roughly to a code of manliness, but it encompasses chivalry, an absolute unquestioning generosity to any guest who arrives at your tent, and unwavering courage in battle.
Without centralized law enforcement, your reputation for upholding Miruwa was your only shield.
If your tribe was known to be generous and fiercely protective of its members, you survived. If you showed weakness, you were absorbed or destroyed.
Which introduces a crucial concept from the source that frames our entire deep dive: Jahiliyyah. Historically, you often see this translated for modern audiences as the age of ignorance.
Right, which paints a picture of a society just stumbling around in the dark, lacking intellect.
But the source pushes back on that translation aggressively.
What's fascinating here is the semantic analysis provided by the renowned scholar Toshihiko Izutsu. He completely reframes this era for us.
I loved this part of the text.
Izutsu argues that in this specific historical context, the word yal, the root of Jahiliyyah, is not the opposite of knowledge, it is the opposite of hilm.
And hilm translates to moral reasonableness, calmness, deliberation, or self-control.
Exactly. So if hilm is calmness, then yal is explosive emotion.
It's an age of wildness, not an age of stupidity.
Precisely. It was a society functioning on a psychological hair trigger. When you combine the harshness of the environment with the rigid demands of Muruwa, you get a culture where emotions are incredibly heightened.
The sense of tribal honor was so fragile that the slightest provocation could ignite a catastrophe. It's an exhausting way to live. Every interaction is scrutinized for disrespect.
And the source provides a staggering example of this volatility: the War of the Sus. This was a brutal intertribal conflict that ravaged the peninsula for 40 years.
And the inciting incident: a minor insult and the killing of a single camel.
40 years of warfare over one camel.
It's almost impossible to fathom the generational trauma of conflict like that. You're talking about a society that swings violently between extreme, self-sacrificing hospitality, slaughtering your last sheep to feed a total stranger, and multi-generational blood feuds over livestock.
But amidst all this volatility, they possessed an incredibly refined cultural anchor. Their supreme art form wasn't architecture.
Right, they weren't building massive pyramids or carving marble amphitheaters. Their supreme art was the spoken word.
The spoken word was their architecture. They were a people of profound memory. And the epicenter for this linguistic obsession was the great market of Ukaz, located near Mecca.
Ukaz wasn't just a place to trade leather and dates. It was the cultural heart of the peninsula. When you look at how Ukaz functioned, it was essentially an ancient, high-stakes poetry competition.
Tribes would gather, and the main event was waging war with verse. And the poet, the sharer, which literally translates to the one who senses, was the most vital asset a tribe possessed.
They weren't just entertainers.
Not at all. The poet was the journalist reporting the news, the historian recording the lineage, and the ultimate propagandist.
If you lost a battle of words at Ukaz, it wasn't just a blow to your pride. It affected your tribe's reputation, which in turn affected your alliances, your creditworthiness, and your physical safety.
The linguistic sophistication required to compete at Ukaz was extraordinary. These poets composed the mulakat, or the hanging odes.
The masterworks of classical Arabic poetry.
Yes. They celebrated the stark, brutal beauty of the desert, the endurance of the camel, and the fierce honor of the tribe. The legend states that these poems were considered so perfect, so intrinsic to their cultural identity, that they were embroidered in gold letters and physically suspended on the curtains of the Kaaba in Mecca.
Embroidered in gold and hung on the holiest site in the peninsula. That tells you everything about their reverence for language right there.
Yeah. These hanging odes essentially standardized the classical Arabic structure. They built the incredibly complex linguistic vessel that would eventually carry the Quranic revelation.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because for centuries, the prevailing narrative has been that while this was a society of brilliant oral memory, it was almost entirely illiterate.
That they spoke exquisite poetry, but they supposedly didn't write.
Exactly. But the source introduces recent archaeological surveys that flip that assumption completely on its head.
Yes, the epigraphic surveys conducted by scholars like Ahmad al-Jalad represent a major paradigm shift in how we view this era. He and his teams have been studying the Safavidic and Thamudic rock inscriptions scattered across the deepest parts of the desert.
And we aren't talking about a few isolated carvings in a palace somewhere.
No, they have documented thousands upon thousands of pieces of rock graffiti.
Right, and the sheer volume changes the story. We aren't looking at elite royal scribes meticulously copying state documents. The people carving these rocks are the nomadic shepherds.
You have guys out watching their flocks in the middle of a harsh volcanic expanse, casually etching their names, carving small prayers to their gods, or recording their grief over a lost loved one directly into the basalt.
It proves that a functional basic literacy was incredibly widespread, even among the most remote populations.
This raises an important question regarding Islamic history and the traditional understanding of the Prophet's background.
Right, because traditionally, the Prophet is described using the Arabic word ummi.
Which has long been translated by many as strictly illiterate. But if we now understand that basic literacy was a casual reality even for isolated shepherds, that translation warrants deeper examination.
The scholarly consensus highlighted in the source suggests that ummi might specifically refer to a lack of formal scriptural training.
Meaning, he was unlettered in the ancient texts of the Torah or the Gospel, rather than literally unable to engage with the written word.
That distinction alters the entire flavor of the historical narrative. The revelation of the Quran didn't arrive to a society stumbling in an illiterate void. It arrived to a culture obsessed with linguistic perfection, that actively practiced writing in the desert, and that held massive annual festivals dedicated to the power of words.
The Quran challenged them in the exact arena they claim to have completely mastered.
The theological audacity of presenting a text that claimed to be linguistically unmatchable to a society of master poets is just profound.
It was a direct confrontation with their greatest point of pride. But the confrontation wasn't merely linguistic, it was fundamentally spiritual. Because to fully grasp the Jahiliyyah, we have to examine the religious landscape of the peninsula.
Which the source describes as a highly fragmented spiritual kaleidoscope. The dominant practice across the interior, naturally, was polytheism and idolatry,
And the absolute center of that idolatry was the Kaaba in Mecca.
which carries a deep tragic irony. Because according to their own history, the Kaaba was originally built by the patriarch Abraham specifically for the worship of the one God.
But by the late 6th century, it had evolved into a spiritual stock exchange. It housed hundreds of different idols.
You had Hubal, the grand moon god made of red agate, standing prominently inside, acting as an oracle. You had powerful goddesses like Alat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, who deeply influenced the daily fears and agricultural hopes of the people in the Hijaz.
The integration of these idols into the Kaaba was also a brilliant piece of commercial statecraft by the Quraysh.
By housing the gods of various surrounding tribes within the sanctuary, Mecca ensured that those tribes would make regular pilgrimages.
Right, tying their spiritual obligations directly to Mecca's economic markets.
But the text points out that this monolith of paganism was showing serious fractures. The peninsula was far from an isolated theological bubble.
You had robust Jewish tribes like the Banu Qurayza and Banu Nadir, deeply entrenched in the northern oases of Yathrib and Khaybar.
They controlled significant agricultural economies, cultivating vast date palm orchards, and they brought with them ancient, well-established monotheistic traditions.
You also had strong footholds of Christianity in the south, particularly in the city of Najran, and among some of the northern proxy tribes we mentioned earlier.
The Arab polytheists were constantly rubbing shoulders with these major scriptural faiths in the markets. They were debating theology while trading leather and incense. The spiritual isolation was breaking down, creating a palpable restlessness.
That restlessness manifests most clearly in a group that completely fascinates me: the Hunafa.
The singular form is Hanif. These were the true seekers of their time. Put yourself in their shoes for a minute. You look at the hundreds of carved wooden and stone idols packed into the Kaaba, and you realize it simply doesn't make sense. You recognize that these inanimate objects cannot be the masters of the universe.
The Hunafa took a radical stance. They rejected the idols entirely. They refused to eat the meat that had been ritually sacrificed to them.
Which, in a society based on communal sharing, meant intense social alienation.
They were essentially excommunicating themselves from the spiritual and social fabric of their tribes. They would wander out into the dunes, seeking the pure, unadulterated monotheism of Abraham.
The day-to-day existence of a Hanif must have been incredibly lonely. To walk away from your tribe's gods is to walk away from your protection. But their very existence proves that the spiritual air across the entire peninsula was thick with anticipation.
The theological tension was building, the commercial networks were expanding, and everyone seemed to be waiting for something to break.
That anticipation is the ultimate key to understanding this era. As the 6th century drew to a close, Arabia was a walking paradox.
On one hand, you have a society defined by brutal, unforgiving tribal warfare, yet capable of the most exquisite, refined poetic expression.
You have an economy driven by international commercial greed, yet entirely dependent on a sanctuary of unbroken sacred truths.
So what does this all mean for you, listening right now?
It means that when you look back at history, global superpowers almost always look at the periphery, the spaces off the edges of their maps, and they dismiss them.
The Byzantine and Sassanid empires viewed the Arabs merely as occasional mercenaries or distant obstacles. They ignored the shifting dynamics of the peninsula at their own peril.
Because while those empires were distracted by their own grandeur and warfare, the stage in Arabia was being set with terrifying precision. The brutal isolation of the desert protected a fiercely independent culture from imperial dilution.
The redirected international trade routes provided a massive, ready-made megaphone to spread any new message outward.
And that deep, aching spiritual vacuum, highlighted by the Hunafa, created an intense hunger for a unifying truth.
The pressure cooker was sealed tight. The geopolitical heat was turned up by the imperial wars, and the internal cultural ingredients were perfectly balanced. The civilization wasn't asleep, it was gathering immense potential energy, preparing for a singular spark.
It was waiting to ignite. And before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, building on that incredible archaeological plot twist we discussed earlier.
The rock inscriptions.
Yes. We talked about those nomadic shepherds carving their names, their prayers, and their profound grief into the sharp basalt rocks of the Heret. I want you to really think about what it means for a civilization's history to be physically etched into its most inhospitable landscapes.
Think about the sheer human desire to be remembered.
To loudly declare, "I was here," in a place that seems designed by nature to completely erase you. How many thousands of deeply personal ancient stories, stories of tribal love, of devastating heartbreak, and of desperate wandering faith, are still out there right now, completely unread, waiting silently under the shifting dunes of the empty quarter today?
It is a profoundly humbling thought. It reminds us that the desert remembers long after the marble palaces of the empires have crumbled and been forgotten.
It absolutely does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Jahiliyyah. Keep questioning the old maps, keep looking past the edges of the known world, and keep exploring. Catch you next time.